Welcome to the Justice Journal podcast. I'm Sacramento County District Attorney Anne Marie Schubert. I hope you enjoy this podcast series where we discuss important public safety issues and provide insight into who we are as an office and what we do both in the courtroom and in the community to provide the highest level of public safety through prosecution, prevention, and innovation.
Welcome to the Justice Journal podcast. I'm Shelley Oreo. In the last episode, we introduced the 1999 hate crime spree in Sacramento committed by the Williams brothers. Today, we'll continue that conversation and talk about how the cases unfolded.
So Tyler he was following direction from his older brother.
That was how we were going to present the case to a jury. Yes, that the older brother was the dominant personality and Tyler was following and assisting his brother.
And until we put it together, I mean, if you looked at these two individuals, they were educated, they were clean looking. I mean, not somebody that you would think is, like a...
Well, so Matthew, I think, had served in the Navy out of high school, had attended college in Idaho.
They were religious.
Yeah.
I mean, to the point where they were ousted out of many different, churches because of their extreme beliefs. But if you were looking at it from the outset, you would say, oh, these are just two guys that are, brothers that are religious
and no
brothers.
criminal history.
Zero.
No. That's what made it really interesting.
And when we started finding this treasure trove of documents, we found all sorts of hate literature. In my view, these were two guys that were clearly white supremacists, but they were in search of a coherent ideology. They were looking into the Christian identity movement, which is a very white supremacist movement, the neo-Nazi movement, all sorts of other things. We found literature from all of those different organizations. And probably shouldn't go without mentioning that they wanted to wear Nazi uniforms at the trial, which puts the prosecutor in a very interesting dilemma. Do you want to degrade the dignity of a federal court, or do you want to point to your defendants and say, Exhibit A?
Right.
Well, he had the mustache and everything because Matthew wanted to look like Hitler.
Yeah. So one point I want to make too is, when we served the search warrants at the shack of Matthews that I've described, I went out that day and I was there. And I remember there was a chart on the wall. And the point of the chart, it was a chronology thing, but somehow the thrust of it was that the lost tribes of Israel were not really from Israel; they were from England, but it was this whole convoluted, with biblical passages and the whole thing. And I thought to myself, wow, they never taught me that in Sunday school. So it was just to elaborate on the point that there was just they were in search of their own, but very much a Christian-based concept here. But certainly not consistent with the tenets of any church that I'm familiar with.
What happened with the two cases then, the arson and the murder? I don't know the order, how they unfolded.
So we were in settlement discussions on the arson case from a fairly early point, and the problem was they were willing enough to admit to the arsons, but they didn't want that to be used against them in the murder case. Obviously, if they admitted to running together during this period of time that bracketed the murders, that could be used, even without an admission to the arsons, that could be used as evidence that they also participated in the Matson-Mauter murders.
So Steve and I were in consultations about this, and I want to really give a shout out to him because he really went out of his way to consult with me in terms of the resolution of the federal case, because it was going to have an effect on ours. And so it was, as I said earlier, it was a very collaborative approach. And then ultimately, they entered pleas in your case.
Right. And we entered into a deal with them that the Shasta DA signed off on, which was evidence exclusion, essentially, at the murder trial, that couldn't be used, their guilty pleas in the arson cases couldn't be used against them, or couldn't be used in the case in chief, at least.
Well, the police couldn't, but we could, under the California Evidence Code, we could submit evidence of other acts or other crimes. So it was our intention to use that evidence
Right.
And so we said, we don't need the pleas. We can prove this because of the great work that Faye and Nina and their cohorts were doing on the evidence on the arson. So our intent was to use the evidence of the arsons and not their guilty pleas against them in our murder case.
The pleas happened first and before the murder case then
Yes.
finished.
So they pled guilty to our charges, and Matthew Williams got 30 years and Tyler got 21 years, kind of in recognition of their differing levels of culpability. And then the case went to Shasta for the main event.
So we, as I mentioned earlier, we alleged special circumstances, which made it a death penalty eligible case. And unfortunately, in the state system, when there's a death eligible case, as you know, Anne Marie, it takes forever. We, as I've already mentioned, had very significant physical evidence of the crimes. They both invoked their right to not make a statement, so we didn't have any statements from them. But almost immediately, Matthew Williams began to entertain media interviews from the jail. And we were kind of happy to let him do that. And he gave lots and lots of interviews, and in which he took credit for the murders. He was very, as Nina said, he was very careful to take responsibilities as to shield responsibility from his brother, and said lots of inflammatory things. Basically said, the Bible says I can kill gay people, those sorts of things. And these two didn't fall too far from the tree. The parents were unusual, shall we say. And a good example of that would be that I think the day after they were arrested, their mother went to visit them at the county jail, and we had a recorded conversation between and we all know in the jail there's a big sign says this may be recorded. So he says to his mother, be careful what you say because this may be recorded. And she said, I can't believe that you did what they said you did. And then he said, well, what'd they say I did? And she said that she took out 2 homos. And then his response was, well, why wouldn't you think I'd do that? So that gives you a sense of the mindset of the parents as well as the murderers. But just a slightly humorous piece of this. He gave an interview. Who was the guy in NBC News, the big shot, the
Is it
retired?
Dan Rather?
Tom Brokaw.
Oh, Tom Brokaw.
He does an interview with Tom Brokaw on the national news one night where he talks about all this stuff. So I went in the next day and I called all my investigators to get together. I said, okay, which one of you guys is flying to New York to give Mr. Brokaw his subpoena? I wasn't going to let that go, right? So, you did the interview, pal. You can come and tell the jury about what he told you. And so ultimately, so we felt obviously very confident in the strength of the case that we had. We knew we had our 2 guys. We knew that both of them were involved. And as time went along, we just dealt, frankly, more with the continuances that were constantly requested from the defense. Our case ultimately, in the fall of 2002, so now we're 3.25 years post-murders, there were 2 things that happened. Number one was the judge granted a change of venue motion from Shasta County because of the tremendous amount of publicity that this case had garnered. And then secondly, Matthew Williams, the older brother, somehow got possession of a razor blade and committed suicide in the Shasta County jail. And I went over that morning. I got the call. It was a Sunday morning, and I got a call from the undersheriff to tell me what had happened. And I went. I wanted to go see, and I don't mean that in a morbid way, but I wanted to see that guy was dead. And because he, in the interim, while housed at the Shasta County jail, he had gotten out of his cell one night with another guy who had committed murder and against whom we were seeking the death penalty. And they had fashioned sort of a homemade tomahawk out of the metal drain in the bottom of the floor and then using toilet paper to build a handle. And they jumped one of the custodial officers while he was on his rounds, and they beat him within an inch of his life. And so this was someone who was a real problem for everybody. So he committed suicide. We lost the change of venue motion. And because really, Matthew, as we discussed earlier, we thought was really the moral or philosophical person behind this thing. We ultimately entered into a plea agreement with Tyler, in which he pled to 2 counts of first-degree murder, the use of a firearm, and the hate crime enhancement. And he got sentenced to something like 65 years to life in state prison, which is where he sits today.
So he's still alive.
Yes. Yeah.
What are all your thoughts about what prompted these series of attacks. They didn't have a criminal history, and then all of a sudden, they, attack 3 synagogues, commit murders, and the third, and all within a pretty short period of time. What are your theories on what sort of prompted all of that?
Well, so I think you can see from our discussion that what's been simmering below the surface is this virulent hate philosophy, and it now came boiling to the surface. And I think what we would have seen had we not captured the Williams brothers is essentially their attempt to start a race war. They had an arsenal. The credit cards that they stole from the Mauder and Matson had been used to purchase an arsenal. And I wanted to, at some point in this discussion, talk about hate crimes, because I think that this is something that the public doesn't necessarily understand. Why do we carve out a particular area of the law and say that's more serious than other areas? And the statistics have shown that hate crimes often are more assaultive. In other words, not necessarily just property crimes, but they have victims. When those assaults occur, they're more violent because they're intended to send a message. They're not motivated by a robbery to get money. They're motivated by hate. They're also committed typically by groups, which make them more dangerous. Crimes are committed against strangers, and they terrorize the community as a whole for that reason. Because now, if I'm walking down the street with $20 bills hanging out of my pocket, I know I'm engaging in some dangerous behavior. But if I'm just walking down the street and I happen to be Jewish or black or gay, I could be assaulted by anyone who has the Williams brothers' motivations. So they wind up terrorizing an entire community. And that's certainly true of our case, because B'nai Israel and the other 2 synagogues, their congregations were traumatized by this and regularly commemorate these because, like the Holocaust, we don't want to forget.
Right. And this was far-reaching. I was actually in Europe on vacation when the first 3 fires occurred. And I knew, I read it in the Stars and Stripes, and I thought, I know what I'm going home to. I know exactly what I'm going to be doing as soon as I hit the ground. And I got involved immediately, but it was that far-reaching.
I can remember in the first 2 or 3 days after we arrested them, and they were in the county jail, and we charged them, looking out my office window, and the mobile trucks from every major network in the country were out there.
Wow.
And I thought to myself, oh man. And then making court appearances and coming out, and literally just the sea of reporters. And so it was not just a national story, but an international story. I will say, though, and this is more of a contemplative observation than anything else, but the Matthew Shepard murder was about the same time, roughly, in the grand scheme of things. And that one seemed to get a lot more attention than the Williams brothers did. And I never really understood that, to be honest with you, because these guys were equal opportunity racists and bigots and actors in terms of committing crimes. And so I was always sort of perplexed why the federal act, it was the Matthew Shepard Act, to add sexual orientation for a hate crime designation. So that one, I just throw that out for consideration. Just struck me as that this case was, I thought, a lot more serious and a lot more significant,
Right.
because of the variety of things these guys had done and seemed willing to do.
And there were a lot more victims. I mean, if you
I don't mean to downplay the Matthew
Right.
Shepard
No.
situation.
But I understand that point, because if you look at how many people were directly affected by the 3 arsons and the abortion clinic and, of course, the double murder, you look at people that, I mean, they now all of a sudden, when they go to church every time, when they go to the congregations, they don't know if they're safe. And during that time, until those arrests were made, they were fearful, and it's something that doesn't leave them. Mm-hmm. So that the definition of a victim is someone who suffers from a loss from a crime, but it doesn't have to be a direct result, right? So you look at every single person in those congregations. When we interviewed them, you could see the fear in their eyes. You could feel how stressed they were, not knowing who would do this and why they would do this.
And who's
and
next?
and who's next, exactly. So I think that it was amazing that the case was put together in the time period that it was, and truly Shasta County did a phenomenal job.
Well, we did it together. And
We
it
did,
really-
but we wouldn't have. It would have taken us a little while. Believe me, we went through so many Delco codes. I can't even tell you. You know, I sit there in my dream and I think, okay, how many places produce this type of bottle cap? How many, and because that's what we were doing. We were, doing every single lead. We were gumshoeing it. But
And we
until
got
it
that
all
break
came together,
on
yeah,
the
we
credit
got that
card.
break.
So let's close out the discussion. Are there any things that you took away that sort of stays with you about this case, and what were your perspectives on this case in general?
I can
Start,
start.
Faye?
Mine's easy. My focus is fairly specific, but I think this case emphasizes the importance of going into a criminal investigation like this and making sure that you take the time to collect everything that you think can be used to link something to something else, even though, it might not be obvious, just like collecting glass from the broken window. How many times would we think, well, that's not very useful, glass is glass, and in forensics, that's not true. And just getting the samples, even though you may never have something to compare it to, in this case, almost everything we picked up had some kind of linkage between certain aspects of this case. And if you don't do it at the beginning, it's really hard to reconstruct it, 2 weeks or a month or a year later.
All right, and if you don't know if it's important at the time, it could be later, so you just don't.
Yeah, you just automatically should do these things, and I think this case emphasizes that more than any other.
Judge Lapham?
Well, my reflection is you can't do a case like this without reflecting on our society, and we think we're enlightened and progressive, and yet in 2019 these kind of things are still happening, and they're happening in a different way. I think originally I talked about hate crimes usually being committed by groups. Not so much anymore. We're seeing the rise of the lone wolf, and the Williams brothers might have been, one of the early iterations of that. I consider them the same identity; they're brothers, but they hear about hate crimes like this, and they're empowered, and they're the copycats who say, "I could do this too," and we just have to be ever vigilant. And I'm always reminded of how much it terrorizes a community like the Jewish community. They lost some very significant documents in this, and they were traumatized in the same way that the Holocaust traumatized them.
So I've been a prosecutor nearly all my legal career, and literally handled thousands of cases over that period of time. And this is the one that stays with me the most. I think about it regularly. So a couple things, and I did want to point this out. So Gary Matteson's father, Oscar Mattson, was a retired professor from Shasta College, and he was our wise old man throughout this whole thing. The way he carried himself throughout this, just the dignity and the class that he demonstrated, always stayed with me. And he was, every time I'd get tired or we were, I think of him. And you keep going, right? This was his oldest son, killed for no reason, and yet the way he carried himself always stayed with me. Two was that, I think I mentioned this before we came on there, I grew up in a small town, Protestant Methodist boy. My parents are still married to each other. And this really, in many ways, caused me to change how I looked at the world. That, all of us are entitled to the protection of law, and the best efforts from those of us who have these positions, irrespective of your sexual orientation or your religious faith or whatever it may be. And it really changed how I saw things. And then the third thing was, and I guess along those same lines, Steve can relate to this, when we have these big cases, we always practice our closing arguments about 1,000 times in our heads before we ever actually get to that moment in time. And there's a famous quote from a German Catholic priest who lived in Nazi Germany. And after the war, he said, I'm not going to get this exactly right, but you'll get the thrust of it. He said something to the effect of, they came for the Bolsheviks and I wasn't a Bolshevik, so I didn't speak up. They came for the Jews and I wasn't a Jew and I didn't speak up. They came for the union leaders and I wasn't a union leader, so I didn't speak up. They came for me and no one spoke up. And I was going to somehow work that into my closing argument because to me, it said so much about this case that in Matt Williams' mind, if he didn't like the color of your eyes, he could kill you. And he had God's blessing to do that. We can't have that. And then the final point I would make is that in these cases, I think I can safely say that if someone thinks they're the instrument of God on this earth, it's not going to end well. And that is just something that I see over and over and over again, whether it's Christians or Muslim extremists or Hindu, whatever the faith may be, it doesn't work.
Wow, how do I follow all those comments?
Right.
Well, I can tell you that this case did have a profound effect on me. I'm biracial, and I look at some of the things that I found out during the case, and it was a little difficult to swallow, frankly. But I would hope that when people encounter people like these two individuals and they're spewing hatred, that they would come forth and tell somebody. I think that in the world we live in now where people have a lot of hatred and they speak about it on public media, social media, see something, say something.
And we'll probably talk more about that in our last part about what we're doing about hate crimes now. Maybe some of that is involved, is that where people are being monitored in a different way, maybe.
Yes.
I don't know, but that's a good point.
Yeah.
Well, thank you all very much. It was a very interesting discussion. We'll have further discussions on this topic, but this is a good starting point.
Join us for our next episode where we continue our series on hate crimes by examining an unsolved double murder in Elk Grove of 2 Sikh men.
Thank you for listening, and I hope you enjoyed this episode. You can find all of the Justice Journal podcasts on our website at sacda.org, iTunes, Google Play, and YouTube.